internal NOPD investigations find Mayor Cantrell's former security guard committed potential criminal violations. Those include public payroll fraud.
As Rob Masson reports, some of the findings were turned over to the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Fox 8 just obtained 2 Public Integrity Bureau reports completed by PIB and an outside law firm the city hired. The reports find now retired Officer Jeffrey Vappie drank alcohol while on duty for the NOPD during 2 different occasions with Mayor LaToya Cantrell. During a previous PIB investigation about the long hours he spent with the mayor inside the city's Upper Pontalba apartment, he denied a romantic relationship with her.
During the initial Pontalba investigation, and he described his relationship with the mayor as purely professional.
Photographs of the mayor and Vappie at 2 high-end New Orleans restaurants prompted the 2 recent PIB investigations. After receiving photos of Cantrell and Vappie dining together at Tableau in the French Quarter in April, the Metropolitan Crime Commission filed its first complaint, with PIB seeking a probe into several potential rule violations. The PIB report on that initial complaint finds the pair consumed alcohol while Vappie was on the clock and carrying a firearm.
Drinking, carrying a gun, showing absolutely no remorse for the departmental rules and policies that resulted in discipline.
The Metropolitan Crime Commission filed a second complaint after it obtained a photo of the pair dining at Doris Metropolitan in July of 2022. That report finds Vappie drank wine at a bar with Mayor Cantrell while on duty. The PIB sustained 13 violations against Vappie, who retired from the NOPD in June, before the PIB reports were complete. The reports conclude Vappie violated professional conduct policies and that he used alcohol while on duty, which likely inhibited his ability to remain attentive on duty. According to PIB, Vappie also claimed overtime while actually not working, and that he neglected his duty by becoming involved in an ongoing relationship with Mayor Cantrell, creating the appearance of impropriety.
Between the 2 of these investigations, there would have been sufficient evidence to document that his relationship with the mayor was not professional, it was personal.
One of the PIB reports detailed a divorce filing from Vappie's wife, which cited 12 specific dates in August and September of 2022, where an affair with someone identified as Mrs. LC allegedly occurred. The PIB and the outside law firm identified potential criminal violations, which were turned over to federal authorities, who indicted Vappie on wire fraud and false statement charges back in July. That federal indictment referenced Vappie's romantic relationship with the mayor. Both have repeatedly denied that, and both refused to be interviewed for these PIB investigations. The head of the Metropolitan Crime Commission says policies were written to prevent executive protection members from socializing with the mayor, but he says those policies were not followed.
That's another flaunting in the face of the police department and the mayor flaunting her authority as mayor, saying that the officer that she's involved in a relationship with, the rules don't apply to him, the rules don't apply to her.
One of the Public Integrity Bureau reports indicates the mayor and Vappie toasted on the balcony of Tableau. The report says Mayor Cantrell lacks the authority to authorize alcohol use by members of her executive protection team while on duty. Rob Masson, Fox 8 Local First.
Goyeneche says that the PIB reports could further bolster a potential federal charge against the mayor. We reached out to the attorneys for Mayor Cantrell and Vappie, and we are waiting to hear back.